Welcome to Real News, folks. This is Mark Steiner. Good to have you with us. Now, I guess many of you have been reading about what happened to Deadspin, the sports site, where writers gave the middle finger to the owners to stop them from being political. They didn't want the right political stuff, just sports stuff straight. Well, they did that. And let's think about these private equity firms for a minute. They are vampires, sucking the lifeblood out of our country, businesses, and the workers. The analogy is really apt. Vulture capitalists symbolize, let's say, I found this out in the article I just read. We're about to talk to the author. The 16th century Countess Bothari, who bathed in the blood of young girls, or the vampire stories from every country on the planet. Our guest today put these analogies together in a bold context, where she wrote about the destruction of the sports website Deadspin, and she looked beyond that to look at the role of these venture vampire capitalists and what they do in our world, what they play in our world, what they're doing to our world. So I want to welcome Kim Kelly back to the Real News, who wrote the article, This is a Horror Story, How Private Equity Vampires Are Killing Everything, for The Nation magazine. And Kim, welcome. Good to have you with us.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for being interested in my weird, bloody little tale.
It was a very strange article, but a really good article. I love the analogy. So let's take a step back for just a second. So you took these, before we jump into who these private equity people are, what they've done, and what happened to Deadspin directly, you created this analogy, this historical analogy with both the mythology and reality of vampires in our world, whatever culture they came from, to what private equity people are doing to our world today. So talk about how that came to you. How did that come into your head? And as you told me before we went on there, you wrote this at 3 a.m, which is probably a very apt time to write it.
Yeah, even better. I'm not going to lie to you. I wrote this on Halloween. Which sounds a little too on the nose, right?
I love it. That's great.
I mean, the piece came about because some editors at The Nation hit me up and said, you saw what's happening with Deadspin. Do you want to write a piece for us about this? Because I'm a labor reporter, and that's sort of what we do. This is very much in my realm, given that I came out of the digital media organizing world. I used to work at Vice. I was an organizer there, yada, yada, yada. So they asked me if I wanted to do this, and I was thinking about it. It's like, well, what's a way that I could write about this in a way that was new, that was interesting, that wasn't the same piece that was being written, because it was a huge story, because it was such a huge event. But I started thinking about, these capitalist vampires. I was like, hang on, vampires. Like this, because we see even just on Twitter, right? The way people speak about private equity and the general capitalist class is like they're vampires, they're bloodsuckers, they're leeches. Like this is the language that, it makes sense when you think about the way that capitalism is structured and the way that these people, these robber barons at the top are, dealing with the working class. But I kept coming back to vampires, and it was Halloween, so maybe I was feeling a little spookier than usual. And I just started thinking about how, this is a horror story. Like what's happening here, like these craven aristocratic jerks are literally sucking the lifeblood away from workers who don't have any much more of a defense than a metaphorical pitchfork. And they've been allowed to do it for centuries, since time immemorial, since way back in the 16th century when, Countess Bathory was out there in her dungeon. And it's just, we see the same story over and over again. It's almost become its own legend, right? The private equity vampire. And so that's what I was thinking about when I approached this piece. And that's, I just kind of rode that metaphor out to the very end.
Yeah, and you certainly did. As I said, I love this piece, but let's just talk a bit about, you were commissioned to write a piece about Deadspin, which we've been talking about here at Real News for the last couple of weeks, and what's happening to the workers at Deadspin. And so that's where this began, right? And I was shocked, did not know the whole backstory of Deadspin and the other online magazines and news journals that are owned by the same companies. So talk a bit about that story and how this private equity owning all of these kind of news sites and what they're doing to kind of suck the lifeblood out of our work as journalists and Americans who want to read this stuff.
Right. I mean, we're seeing it play out across various industries, but right now it's just really blatant and concerning in media, specifically in digital media, where you have these private equity firms and soulless billionaires who swoop in and they buy a website or a package of websites, and then they decide to either scrap it and sell it for parts or try to remake it in their own image. And what happened with Deadspin was that the workers resisted. Like they did not want to, they weren't willingly led to the slaughter. Like they fought back. And I mean, we're at a point where the free press is under attack from, the highest office in the land. Like just in general, journalism is in a crisis. And now we're seeing this sort of economic side of this crisis where it's difficult for digital media publishers to make money. And so they're looking for other ways to acquire that capital. And this is where private equity comes in. They come in, they've got all this money, they're going to sweep you off your feet, they're going to get you out of bankruptcy, they're going to fix everything. And then they acquire these independent, like thriving websites, and then they just suck the blood out of them and toss them aside. And what happened with Deadspin, the reason people are so captivated is because they disrupted that narrative, right? Like that's the horror story. Like the vampire comes in, it sucks away your blood, and then it leaves you lifeless. In this case, the villagers fought back. And that's why people are responding so viscerally to it.
So talk about the company that actually bought these sites. It was more than just Deadspin. I mean, I didn't realize the sites that some of them I read, they own this long list of sites of all kinds. Mm-hmm. So talk a bit about that company and what exactly they did.
It's a whole constellation, right? Like this company, it's now known as Geo Media, which is run by the CEO, Jim Spanfeller, who's a Forbes guy who came in and bought up. It's like Jezebel, Kotaku, The Root, Splinter, Was Deadspin, Lifehacker, like this whole constellation of former Gawker media sites, except Gawker, RIP. And they're all swept up in this deal after, this Peter Thiel funded Hulk Hogan chaotic situation where the company was sued out of existence. Jim Spanfeller came in, and this was, man, it's been a crazy one, right? Because it was Gawker Media, and then Univision bought this sort of damaged company, and then Univision couldn't figure out what to do with these websites, and they weren't making the kind of money they wanted to see. And so Jim Spanfeller swept in, and he bought all these websites. And it seems like from reading some really incredible reporting that, now former Deadspin writers and Splinter writers within the organization wrote about what that process has been like, it seems like they just came in and screwed everything up. It seems like this man, he came in and installed a bunch of his cronies from Forbes who, Forbes is doing its thing, or no disrespect to Forbes, but Forbes and Deadspin and Splinter and like the Gawker Mediaverse, they're diametrically opposed. So they came in and they essentially wanted to quash worker dissent and quash all of this sort of fiery, irreverent vibe that everybody working there had, because it was a beautiful collection of weirdos. And, they ended up killing off Splinter, which was a fantastic that was the next one. It was a fantastic political commentary site that was really popular. And they just killed it off. And then they came for Deadspin. And I think the people at Deadspin sort of saw the writing on the wall, and they knew something was up, something bad was going to happen. And then it all happened so quickly and so chaotically and so definitively that now Deadspin, to reference another horror trope, Deadspin is just a zombie. And everyone who used to work there is gone. So
if you mentioned a lot of other equity firms that took over many things in our country, from grocery store chains to retail, and just putting everyone out of work. Tens of thousands of people being put out of work because of the equity firms buying and pushing people out, which is why I thought the analogy to vampires was very apt. So you can talk a bit about that, but also what happens in our country when private equity takes over all these companies, shuts them down because they're not the kind of profit they want to make, thousands of people thrown out of work. This is like the 21st century version of the Gilded Age and what's happening to people now in America and around this world. So what do you do? Talk a bit about some of the examples you gave, but also what we do to drive a stake through the heart of these equity firms and stop them from destroying what we have.
Yeah, you're entirely right. We're basically in a new Gilded Age, and these are the robber barons. And back then, the only thing that really happened to rein them in was increased government regulation and antitrust laws. And now we're at a point where regulation is a dirty word because of the current administration, who seem to just love making it as terrible as possible for working people to survive. So we're in a place where, we have these private equity firms, they're buying up digital media properties, but they're also buying up hospitals. They're buying up nursing home chains. They're buying up places where you get payday loans. They even bought the Playboy Mansion. Like there's every possible area of American economic industry, like they're there. They're lying in wait. They might be in the shadows. They might be waiting. They might not have struck yet, but they're going to. And I mean, the only way, like I said at the end of the piece, my original ending was a little strong, I think, for my editor, who asked me to tone it down, because my first ending was more along the lines of, well, we need to bring back the guillotine, or at least. And my editor was like, well, let's maybe think about a different way to say that, because we can't advocate for mass murder. But you're the editor. But yeah, essentially, the only way you can really rein in these sort of vicious corporate raiders is to regulate the hell out of them.
So what would be that guillotine?
Well, I mean, you remember the French Revolution?
Oh, I don't remember that. I mean, other than really chopping off their heads, what would be the guillotine in your mind? Well, what would it be? I mean, in other words, if you look at what happened to Deadspin and all the other companies you talked about, hospitals being shut down to be made into condos, whatever they want to make them into, in poor Black and Latino communities, all the stuff you wrote about in this article. So there has to be a way to stop them. There has to be a way to say, no, this is not the kind of world we're going to have. So what is that guillotine? What is that stake in the heart of the vampire in the coffin? For you, what is that?
That's a really difficult question, right? Like, how do I solve capitalism?
Yes. How do you solve capitalism, Kim? We're going to answer that right now. How do you solve capitalism? No.
God, I mean, that is always the question, right? Like, here is this horrible thing that's happening. We don't know how to stop it. What can we do to sort of put the brakes on this speeding train? And I don't have the answer either. I think in terms of private equity, I'm not as studied in the economic, like, scary, weird numbers realm as they are. I don't know how to deal with rich people, but I think Deadspin I think what happened to Deadspin is a really good example of the kind of thing that we can be doing. Like, the only way we can actually fight back is if we're relying on collective worker power. When you look at what happened with Toys R Us, when they were bought up and then driven into bankruptcy by more of these vampires, they were deprived of the severance pay that they were owed. They came together and they fought back. They sued the bejesus out of them, and they finally got their money. It's like, and it's like what we saw with the Black Jewel miners. That wasn't a private equity situation, but it was still a situation where this big, horrible company with a whole lot of money was withholding those funds from the workers who actually earned it and created that capital. And they were like, well, we're not going to let you get away with that. We are going to do something about it. Like, we can't allow these vampires to continue to stalk the world unopposed, right? And I mean, even going back to this old analogy, and it's not quite the vampire analogy. It's a little bit more Frankenstein-y, right? But what happens when there's a monster in your midst? You gather your friends, you gather some pitchforks, and you do what you can to get them out of your hair, right? It is a big question, but I think really all we can do is realize that you can still kill a vampire, right? Like, there are wooden stakes, and there are silver bullets, and there's garlic. And to translate that into real world terms, there are, unionizing your workplace and talking to your coworkers and refusing to take this BS lying down. And Spin is a great example of that. Just being like, you know what? No, like, we're not going to let you walk all over us. We're going to walk all over you first.
And as you're saying, the stake in the heart is workers organizing themselves and being strong and regulating these industries so they cannot do what they do and not allow them to do it in the first place. Make it against the law, not allow them to do it.
Much way of saying what I was trying to say.
And for me, it's really refreshing, Kim, to have somebody of your generation and all these young people coming up and really writing about labor and doing the fight, which is really important. So I'm glad you're out there writing about vampires and equity capitalists. And we look forward to talking to you a great deal more.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for your writing. And I'm Mark Steiner here at the Real News Network. Let us know what you think. We'll have Kim Kelly and more folks like Kim Kelly on this network so we can really make some changes. Take care.
Hey y'all, my name is Tharna Noor and I'm a climate crisis reporter here at the Real News Network. This is a crucial moment for humanity and for the planet. So if you like what we do, please support us by subscribing at the link below. Thank you.